On a Wednesday afternoon, my mom called to tell me that my grandmother was dying. I had no reaction. I hadn't seen or talked to my grandmother since she moved to Florida when I was a teenager. That was 20 years ago. My grandmother was miserable and we never had much of a relationship, or so I thought. The doctor said my grandmother had days to live, and my mom and dad were heading down to Florida to say their goodbyes. They wanted to know if I wanted to come along. Sure, I said, even though I had nothing to say to her. The woman was practically a stranger. My only memories of Dad's mother were her old dusty house that smelled of mold and how she stared daggers at me when I was a small child. But when I hung up the phone with my mom, other memories began clawing their way to my surface. Fragments and snippets, mainly, but they were there. My old childhood bedroom, an old telephone, and my grandmother's voice on the other line. I began to put it together, a sequence of events that had sunk deep down to places I couldn't find. And so the night before we were supposed to leave for Florida, I sat down in my parents' living room and attempted to assemble the puzzle. Speaking to my parents with a mug of hot chocolate in my hand, my story spilled out. When I was 10 years old, I had an old rotary phone with spinning and clicking dial on the nightstand next to my bed. At 2 a.m. one night, the clanging ring of the phone startled me awake. I picked up the receiver and heard nothing but ragged and harsh breathing. It went on, and I just laid in my bed with the receiver in my ear, just listening. I eventually fell asleep and awoke with the receiver still on my shoulder and the dial tone beeping in my ear. A few nights later, the phone rang again at 2 a.m. I lifted the receiver and was again greeted with the same labored breath. But this time there was a voice. My grandmother's voice. Someone's been a bad boy. A very bad boy. The words came out slow and methodical, each syllable more important than the last. I just listened in my dark and quiet room, unable to move, unable to run to my parents. No one knows what you did, but I know. The mug of hot chocolate shook in my hand as I told my parents what I thought my grandmother said. My dad's eyes were glazed over, deep in thought, like he couldn't believe that his own mother would do something like this. My mom looked at me with pleading eyes that begged the question, why didn't you tell me what happened? The fact is, I was a bad boy. I'd done typical naughty 10-year-old things. I'd slugged a kid on the playground and broke his glasses. I'd pocketed a candy bar at the store without paying. I'd cheated on a spelling test. Somehow my grandmother had known these things, and I remembered being a kid, lying in bed with the phone at my ear, desperately not wanting my parents to discover the awful things I'd done. Because somehow, my awful, wretched grandmother knew. I'm not sure how many calls there were. A handful, perhaps. But one night, a few weeks after the first phone call, the situation changed. I was again awoken by the clanging of the phone in the dead of night. I lifted the receiver from its cradle and put the phone to my ear and was greeted by the hoarse breathing of an old woman. I'll be there soon. I know what you did, Ben. My name's not Ben, but that didn't make the least amount of difference to me at the time. The phone went dead in my ear, and I then noticed the silence all around me. I listened intently to every creak in the house, every rustle of the wind through the branches outside my window, and then I heard the jiggling of the front door downstairs. I crept from my room and tiptoed down the hallway, and I knelt down at the top of the stairs, peering through the wooden rails. The front door squeaked open no more than 6 inches, and a hand reached inside, gripping the end of the door. I gawked at the hand's bony fingers and fingernails so long they were beginning to curl, and I heard the breathing, the same gravelly and throaty noise from the phone. I turned away, put my back against the railings, hugged myself, and began to cry. My dad must have heard my whimpering because suddenly he was there, picking me up and sheltering me. I remember my eyes pinching shut and not looking at the doorway. I wasn't sure if the woman with the curved fingernails had come all the way inside, or if she'd simply slinked away into the night. My dad took me into his bedroom and I slept between my parents, shivering softly. My story ended. That was all I could remember. My parents sat in silence until my mom spoke up. She remembered that night. It was the only time after the age of 5 that I'd crawled into bed with them. My dad still looked spaced out. He had no memory of that evening, he said. Couldn't remember picking me up and couldn't remember carrying me into my parents' room. When we touched down in Florida, we cabbed it to the hospital and were about to walk through the sliding glass doors when my dad stopped. He turned around, red in his eyes, and he began to sob. He collapsed onto a bench and said he couldn't go through with it. He couldn't accuse his own mother. He couldn't interrogate a feeble old woman on her deathbed. I had an affair, he stammered, 20 years ago, and he had a child with another woman. A child the woman named Ben. My mom and I stood in the shadow of the hospital, shell-shocked. My story had finally opened up something inside of him, my dad said, and he was determined to stop living a lie. I left my parents and dazedly stumbled inside. Nothing made sense. I needed to see my grandmother. I needed to know the truth. I found my way to my grandmother's room, but she was already dead. My aunt and uncle stood vigil by her frail corpse, holding her hand. There were no curling fingernails, no elongated fingers, just a wrinkled, dead woman. Maybe if I'd gone inside minutes earlier, I'd have recognized that horse breath as my grandmother inhaled and exhaled one more time. But now I'll never know. I always wonder about that person that called me on the phone and crept into my house all those years ago. Was it not my grandmother after all, and just some cruel trick played by my dad's mistress? Or someone that knew about my dad's affair? It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was my mom. I found her sunk into a lobby sofa and sat down next to her. She looked oddly peaceful. She probably just hadn't absorbed everything yet. I put my hand on my mom's shoulder and then she thanked me for telling the story, for remembering it all, because it brought out the truth from my dad. And even though the truth was horrible and would change things forever, it was good to know. But then I began to question my own story. Was it all in my head? Why did I not remember any of it until a few days ago? My eyes welled with tears. I told my mom it felt like I destroyed our family because of a story that could be make-believe. A story from a 10-year-old who was now lost to time. My mom reassured me. She believed my story was true. She didn't know who was in our house and what my dad might have seen that night, but she believed me. But still, there's one part of my story she didn't understand. That old rotary phone in your bedroom. You do remember that was a play phone, right? So starting from August 4th, I've been getting phone calls. The ID would show up as unknown caller. Knowing it's an advert or scam, I wouldn't pick up. Also, when I pressed the hang up button on my phone, the ringer would be muted. One night, I get a call from the unknown caller. So I muted the ringer for one call. 10 seconds later, it rings again. I mute it, and this time, when I muted the ringer, the ring kept going. As much as I would mute it, it just kept ringing. So at last, I picked it up and heard a screeching noise like metal being grinded. Needle on a glass, nail on a chalkboard, all that shit combined together. It dazed me for some reason, and I started getting this lightheaded feeling and wooziness. I hang up the call immediately. 10 minutes later, it rings again. This time I pick it up and hear breathing through the other line. And it wasn't deep male breathing. It sounded female-ish. So I yelled, "Whoever this is, you better stop calling." The breathing then stopped, and the line got cut. And I just let it go after that. Now, today, I got an email from a person named Unknown Caller. Freaked out as fuck, I opened it and it said, XIII sunt nos voltus vobis. At first, I didn't know what it meant. I knew XIII means a Roman numeral, so I Google it. XIII turns out to be the number 13. I go to Google Translate, type in sunt nos voltus vobis. The language that was selected was Latin. I translate the sentence to English, and it pops up as, We are looking for you. Nothing has happened since then, but I'm getting really paranoid. I'm a police officer at the Vancouver Police Department in Vancouver, Washington, or I used to be. I felt like I needed to post this here. I quit my job today because of a series of phone calls I got one night and one earlier today. Here they are. Please note that it is not exact, just what I can recall. Call 1 received at around 6:45 p.m. Me. Yes, hello, this is the Vancouver Police Department. What's your emergency? Woman. There's something in my house. Please. There's a man. He's been following me. I thought I lost him on the highway, but I don't know. There's someone in my house. Please come. Me. Yes, ma'am. Sending an officer there right now. Please stay safe. Woman. Thank. Slight rushing. Call dropped. Call 2 sent around 6:50 p.m. Note, I called her back directly after the call was dropped. Woman. He's in the room. Call dropped. Call 3 sent around 6:50 p.m. Note, I called her back directly after the call was dropped. Slight rustling, whimpering, and crying. Don't check under the bed. Don't check under the bed. Don't check. Leave me alone! Call dropped. After this, I called the officer who was on his way. He told me he was 5 minutes away. I said, hurry, and hung up. I dug my head into my hands. Call received around 6:55 p.m. Man. If I hear a siren, the girl dies. Call dropped. I proceeded to call the officer and told him to turn off his sirens and to take the back entrance. The address given was to a house just next to a road, the road being hidden by a large fence. I told him to park there so his car is hidden, to jump over the fence to get in. I also told the chief about the situation and he sent out more officers. Call received around 7:10 p.m. Man, that was a good try, but the officer you sent was dead. And I'd like you to hear something else. Woman. Please, help me. The man is wearing a mask. I can't see his face, but he's large. About 5'6", large hands and big feet. Man. Bitch. What you just heard was the sound of her throat being slit. And guess what, Officer Johnson? You're next. Call dropped. Tears were streaming down my face. The officer I had sent down there was young, about 26. The woman sounded young too, but now they were both dead because of me. And how did the murderer know my name? My name, by the way, is Mitchell Johnson. I reported everything to the chief, then resigned from duty. This morning at exactly 6:39 a.m., I received a call on my cell phone. Man, I'm coming, Johnson. And then he said my address. Call dropped. I left my house, and I'm currently at a coffee shop. I called the police, who are all at my house right now waiting for the killer. I'll update you as soon as I can. Update. So the killer showed up, then left. He drove in a blue Nissan Altima 2012, got out wearing a mask, sniffed the air, then got back in his car and drove away. Police got pictures of his mask, a clown, his stature, his weapon, and his license plate. They tracked the plate down to a man named Nathan Oliver, a known serial killer in the Vancouver area. The only problem, Oliver died in a meth lab explosion 4 weeks ago. The police are saying car theft, which I agree with, but a little part of me is screaming ghost, ghoul, zombie. I know it's crazy, all I know is that he's dangerous. I've been hiding out in the police station. I also received another call from the man, which was traced. Call received at about 6:45 p.m. Oliver. Don't want to see me, officer? Me. Listen, you have to give yourself in. If you actually believe you can kill me, you're delusional. Oliver. Officer, you wouldn't mind if I gave your mother a visit, would you? Call dropped. Before you freak out, my mom is fine. I called her immediately after and she said she drove down to the station. That's all I got for you guys now. I'll post again if anything happens. I still can't forget about that poor woman.